So hi everyone, welcome back to another video. We're going to be continuing with our October-November 2024 paper 11 of chemistry O-levels, and we have completed the first 6 questions in part 1, so we're going to be continuing with the 7th question. Let's read it. ठीक है, chrome alum is a salt that contains 2 different cations. ठीक है, this is a very important tip that you read out the questions aloud to yourself, because when you read out the questions aloud, you're engaging your 2 senses, like the sense of hearing and the sense of vision, and you outperform and you perform better that way. ठीक है, it contains 2 different cations and 1 anion. Let's highlight the important bits of information that we have 2 different cations and 1 anion. So cation is a positive ion. Let me write it. Cation is a positive ion and an anion is a negative ion. ठीक है? That's very basic information that you must know. ठीक है? The ions present in chrome alum are K+, Cr 3+, K is potassium, Cr is chromium, and SO4 2 negative, which is a sulfate ion. ठीक है? Now we know that we have 2 different cations. We have 1 anion, and the 2 different cations are potassium and chromium, and the 1 anion is a sulfate ion. What is the formula of the salt? ठीक है? Now, important bit over here is, instead of looking at the options and confusing yourself and trying to figure out the right one, why don't you yourself try it? Instead of looking at the options, trust me, they're gonna confuse you. You yourself try it, ठीक है? Now, that's pretty easy कि ये +1 का मतलब होता है there is 1 over here. Now, let's count the charges in total. We know that chrome alum, whatever this thing is gonna be a neutral salt. What do I mean by neutral is the sum of all the charges. ठीक है? ये मेरे पास positive charges हैं मेरे, and ये मेरे negative charges हैं. ठीक है? ये मेरे positive charges हैं, ये negative charges हैं. इन दोनों का sum equals to 0 होएगा. ठीक है? That's the piece of information I know for sure. ठीक है? Now that is potassium, which is a +1. And we have chromium, that's 3 positive. Now, one thing over here we must know is कि देखें, now we have 2 ions, 2 different ions, and the total positive charge we have is, ठीक है, एक पोटाशियम है, एक क्रोमियम है. पोटाशियम के ऊपर +1 है, क्रोमियम के ऊपर +3 है, और जो टोटल पॉजिटिव चार्ज है दोनों को कंबाइन करके वो हमारे पास है पॉजिटिव. ठीक है, देखें, ये +1 + +3 क्या आता है, इज इक्वल्स टू +4. What is the net positive charge? It's +4. I hope that makes sense to you guys. देखें, ये हमारे पास +1 था, ये हमारे पास +3 था, तो हमने इस 3 को और इस 1 को कंबाइन करके अपना टोटल पॉजिटिव चार्ज निकाल लिया. 2 कैटाइंस थे, जो कि आ गया +4. ठीक है, अब नाउ लेट्स मूव ऑन टू द सल्फेट पार्ट. वी नो दैट वी हैव only 1 anion, which is sulfate. ठीक है? There is no anion except sulfate, so sulfate's gonna have a charge that should balance out this +4. ठीक है? Now, one sulfate, it has a charge of 2 negative. ठीक है? However, we need that amount of sulfates that balance out +4. ठीक है? We need to balance out this +4. ठीक है? One sulfate has a charge of 2 negative. We need a charge of -4 to balance out +4, so we get 0. ठीक है? We know that the net charge of a neutral compound is always going to be 0. We got to create a 0. ठीक है? We have +4 charge, and now we need a -4 charge to balance it out, so we get a 0. ठीक है? I hope this part it makes complete sense, because that's simple maths. ठीक है? Now one sulfate has a charge of 2 negative. Okay, one has a charge of 2 negative. So we need -4. Okay, we need -4. So how many sulfates are going to be take? We're going to take 2 sulfates. Because देखें -2 अगर एक पे है उसमें अगर हम -2 ऐड करते हैं तो हमारे पास -4 आएगा. हमें -4 चाहिए तो हम 2 सल्फेट्स लेंगे ताकि हम +4 को बैलेंस कर सकें. So now we're going to be taking 2 sulfates. Now let's create our own, kind of salt. We are going to take 1 potassium, that is K. We're going to take 1 chromium, and now all this part has a total charge of a +4. And now we got to take 2 sulfates to balance out +4. That's going to be SO4, and we're going to take 2 of them. ठीक है, जब भी हम एक that's a polynomial or polyatomic ion. Sorry, not polynomial, it's polyatomic. Well, that's a confusing term, but what I mean to say by this is that whenever you have like something like NO3 or SO4 and you're taking 2 of them or 3 of them, then what you do is you don't add a 2 like under this 4. That means that you're only taking 2 for the oxygen part. You got to take the whole ion 2 times. So you add brackets around it, and with the help of the brackets then you add 2 over here, and that would mean that you are taking 2 of the entire ions. ठीक है, so let's continue with our. ठीक है, अब we have made this +4 thing over here, and we've taken 2 sulfates to balance it out, and now we have a -4 over here. ठीक है, we have a completely balanced salt, and the net charge of this salt is 0. Why it's 0? Because we have +4, we have -4. I hope this part makes sense. Now let's check out the correct option. What matches our salt? A does not matches because A part only has 1 sulfate. ठीक है, we have to take 2 sulfates. We have to take 2 sulfates. ठीक है, because this is +4. We need, this is +4 and we need -4. So we need to take 2 sulfates. Well, option B seems correct because this part makes it +4. This part makes it a -4. Well, that's a balanced salt. So the correct answer is going to be option B. Okay, let's view option C and D as well. Well, option C is absolutely wrong because this part is +4 and that this part is, देखें, एक सल्फेट है -2. एक second. Look, 1 sulfate is -2, and here if you're taking 3 sulfates, that's going to be -6. So, well, that's not balanced. We need a -4. This is wrong. Now let's check out this one. Well, this one seems a bit more tricky because now we have, instead of 1 potassium earlier, now we have 2 potassiums. ठीक है, what we used to do earlier, we're going to do the same thing. 1 potassium has a charge of +1. And now how many potassium do we have? We have 2 potassium. 1 has a charge of +1, so 2 will have, combined charge of 2 will be +2. ठीक है, अगर वो आपसे पूछें पोटाशियम का अकेला, so it's +1. But now we have 2, that's why we're taking +2. Chromium, earlier in the question we were told it's +3. The net charge of this entire thing is a +5. Okay, it's simple. I've just added 2 and 3, which makes a +5. I hope that makes sense. Now let's see the net charge of this. 1 sulfate has a charge of -2. We have 3 sulfates. Okay, so we're going to multiply -2 with a 3 and we get a -6. Well, that's wrong because to balance out a +5, this is a +5, we need a -5 over here and we're getting a -6. Well, that doesn't make sense, so this option D is also wrong and option B is correct. I hope this MCQ made sense to you guys. Now let's move on to the next one. Question number 8 says the table gives some information about barium and chlorine. ठीक है, what we are given in the table is barium ka relative atomic mass, chlorine ka mass, and the group in the periodic table. Now, what does the group in the periodic table tells us? This is the group in the periodic table. Barium is in group 2. What does it mean when you're in group 2? Group 2 simply means that this is your last shell, okay? This is your last shell, and group 2 means that you have two of these electrons in your last shell, okay? And when you have 2 electrons, that is barium, Pa. And group 2 means you have 2 electrons in your last shell, hence in order to stabilize yourself, you gotta need 8, but you only have 2 electrons. So what you guys are gonna do is, instead of gaining 6 electrons to fulfill it, you lose these 2 electrons. And when you lose 2 electrons, your negative charge decreases. It was -8 and it was +8. +8 is for the protons in the nucleus and -8 were your electrons. Now you've lost 2 electrons. How many electrons you've lost? These 2. You have, so -8, you -2, and that's going to be -6, +8. +8 is for the protons because these are the protons. Proton is +8, electrons is -8, and these are the electrons, and it balances out to be a 0. But now what you've done is you've lost 2 electrons. In order to stabilize yourself, you've lost these 2 electrons. Okay? This and this you've lost now. So now what do you have? You have 6 electrons, and that's going to give you a +2 charge. So group 2 means you lost 2 electrons and now you have a charge of +2. Now let's move on to chlorine. What do we know about chlorine? That's the relative atomic mass, and the second thing we know is it's in group. This V is representing 5 and these lines represent 1. So 5, we have 2 of these lines, okay? We have 2 of these lines. So 5 plus 1 is equals to 7, okay? You can check this out from the periodic table given at the last as well, but if you don't know, that's how you calculate the Roman numbers. It's in group 7. What does group 7 means? Group 7 simply means that in your last shell you have 7 electrons. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that's a 7. And now in order to stabilize yourself, again you gotta need 8 electrons. You only have 7 electrons. That is chlorine. So what you're gonna do, you're gonna gain 1 electron. Now you have 1 more electron than proton, so you're going to get a charge of -1. That's simply what group 7 in the periodic table means. So let's now study all the options using this information only. A student makes 3 statements. Statement number 1 is now before reading the statements, you should know what you have to extract from the statements. You have to extract which statement is correct. Okay, now let's read the statements. There is more than one isotope of chlorine. There is more than one isotope of chlorine. Well, what do you think about it? Is that true? Look, the relative atomic mass of chlorine is 35.5. What is this 0.5 telling you guys? Obviously, this 0.5 tells us that, have you ever heard that number of relative atomic mass क्या होता है? It is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. Yeah, I'm right now. Have you ever heard that an atom has 18.5 neutrons or 16.7 protons? Have you ever heard that the number of protons and neutrons are in decimals? Never. Now, the number of protons and neutrons are never in decimals. So how come you get, when you are adding your protons and neutrons, how come you get 35.5? Well, that is the relative atomic mass. This means that what we have done is we've taken the mass of 2 chlorine isotopes and divided it by 2. That's how you get 35.5. Okay? Because simply you cannot get this by adding protons and neutrons. There got to be isotopes, okay? And you've taken the relative mass, okay, of both the isotopes. That's how you get 35.5. So statement 1 is correct. There is more than one isotope of chlorine. There has to be more than one. Otherwise, you couldn't have ever got 35.5. That's correct. Statement 2 is there may be more than one isotope of barium. There may be. Well, we are not sure about this. There may be, yeah, there can be. Okay? There can be an isotope of barium. There can be more than one. Yeah. Okay? We are not clear. And the question is also not saying that there is exactly. Okay? There may be. So, well, there may be. Statement 3 is the relative formula mass of barium chloride is 208. Well, that's good because, dekhe, barium chloride, what examiner is running test over here is, do you know the formula of barium chloride? Well, let's form the formula. Barium, as we know earlier, it was a 2 positive. Whenever you're writing symbols, don't write, plus 2. Again, don't write plus 2. That's wrong. You always write 2 plus. That's how you write your oxidation states on. Oxidation state is simply the number, this number is the oxidation state. Together we know that our barium is 2 plus and our chlorine is 1 negative. That's the charge on chlorine. Okay, so how do you form ionic equations, ionic compounds, the formula? You have to form barium chloride. Look, that's simple. You have a positive 2. You got to, in order to balance it out, you need a negative 2. Only a negative 2 can balance a positive 2. Yeah, am I correct in this? Only a negative 2 can balance out a positive 2. So what you need to do is, you have negative 1 over here. So in order for the total, for it to be negative 2, you can take 2 chlorines, 2Cl. 2Cl can give you a 2 negative. देखें, एक chlorine का 1 negative है. So it's easy and simple, fair that if you take 2 chlorines, that's going to be 2 negative. Okay? So what you've done is you've taken 2 chlorines to balance out this positive 2 over here, because in a neutral compound, you got to balance all the charges. So you take 1 barium and you take 2 chlorines. So it's BaCl2, and that's important. And now let's calculate the mass of it. For barium, you got to check the atomic number you're given with the. It's 137. You take 1 time 137. You add 2 times. You're going to take the mass of chlorine. That's 35.5. 35.5. You got to calculate this from a calculator. Let me calculate it. 137 plus 2 times 35.5. Well, that is 208. So statement 3 is also correct, and 1, 2, 3 option A is going to be the correct option. All 3 statements are correct. Now let's move on to MCQ number 9, which says, which mass of carbon contains, mass of carbon, the keyword's going to be highlighted, contains the same number of atoms as 16 grams of sulfur. Okay, देखें, for this you got to use ratio method. Look, now what we know is we have, the MR of sulfur is 32. The MR of sulfur is 32. What can we deduce from this? Your MR is equal to your mass of 1 mole. That's going to be the mass of 1 mole. Your MR, let me repeat my statement, the MR is the mass of 1 mole. MR is of sulfur is, you can check it from the periodic table, ठीक है? It's at the last. Whenever you feel confused, please don't rush your grades for, a bit of, I don't want to check it. Go check the periodic table. The MR of sulfur is 32. That means the 32 grams. MR is whatever is the MR of a compound, of an element, it is the mass of 1 mole of that element. Okay, the MR of sulfur is 32. So that means that is the mass of 1 mole of sulfur. MR is 32, so that means that's the mass of 1 mole of sulfur. Now we have 16 grams of sulfur. So how many moles of sulfur we have? 16 grams means X moles. Just solve this simple by ratio method. That's going to be, let me draw a line over here. That's going to be simple by ratio method, 16 divided by 32. That's going to give you 0.5 moles. Let me repeat what I said was, देखें 32 grams में आपके पास 1 mole है, तो 16 grams में आपके पास X है. Simple by using ratio method. You divided 16 by 32, you got 0.5 moles. This means you have 0.5 moles of sulfur. Acha, number of atoms in 1 mole is 1 mole of any element. You have 6 point, ये तो simple, it's a very basic information, 6.02 into 10 exponent 23 particles you have in 1 mole of any element. ठीक है, तो 0.5 मोल भी any element के आपके पास इतने ही particles होंगे. इसको ये 1 मोल में होते हैं, इसको divide कर दें 2 से. So that's going to be for 0.5 moles. बट हमें नंबर ऑफ़ पार्टिकल्स से नहीं है, बस हमें पता चल गया कि 16 ग्राम में सल्फर के 0.5 मोल्स हैं. तो अब हमें इनमें से वो वाला मास सिलेक्ट करना है जिसमें कार्बन के हमारे पास 0.5 मोल्स हों. ठीक है, वी जस्ट नीड, बिकॉज वी नो दैट वी आर गिवन विथ 16 grams ऑफ सल्फर विच मीन्स 0.5 moles ऑफ सल्फर. सो नाउ वी नीड द मास ऑफ कार्बन दैट हैज़ एग्जैक्टली 0.5 moles ऑफ कार्बन. अब कार्बन का देख लेते हैं. कार्बन का MR है 12 विच मीन्स कार्बन के 1 मोल में 12 grams होते हैं. ठीक है, इन 1 mole ऑफ कार्बन यू हैव 12 grams. सो व्हाट डू वी नीड द मास इन 0.5 moles. Well, in 0.5 moles, if you solve it by ratio method, you have X mass. X is going to come 6 grams. ठीक है, that means you're going to take 6 grams of carbon because it is going to have 0.5 moles. And how did we get 0.5 moles? Because the sulfur we are taking is 0.5 moles. So that's going to be option B. Let's move on to question number 10. ठीक है, compound X contains carbon, hydrogen and oxygen only. It has an MR of this. ठीक है, 100 gram of the compound contains 40 gram of carbon, 6.7 gram of hydrogen. How many oxygen atoms are there in each molecule of compound X? ठीक है, in order to find the number of oxygen atoms, what do we have to do? First, we should know the molecular formula. How will we know the molecular formula? First, we have nothing. We just have the simple masses. So first we're going to figure out the empirical formula. From that we're going to dig out to the molecular formula, and from that we're going to see that how many oxygen atoms are there. ठीक है, सबसे पहले let's write down the ratios. I hope you guys know how to find the empirical formula. If you don't know, no worries, we're going to learn it. That is carbon ratio hydrogen ratio oxygen. ठीक है, we have 40 of carbon, 40 grams. We have 6.7 grams of hydrogen. That is 6.7 grams of hydrogen. And देखो, total हमारा 100 था. टोटल हमारे 100 grams थे. 100 में से 40 कार्बन हो गए. ठीक है, 6.7 हाइड्रोजन हो गए तो ऑक्सीजन कितने बच गए? Obviously 100 minus 40. In order to get oxygen, we're going to subtract minus 40 minus 6.7 grams. ठीक है? So just do simple mathematics. 100 minus 40 minus 6.7, and that's going to give you 53.3 grams of 53.3 grams of oxygen. ठीक है? Now we have the masses. What is, we need to find the moles. ठीक है? Empirical formula के लिए सबसे पहला step होता है moles find करना. अब हमें moles का formula आता है that moles is equal to the mass over mr. ठीक है? Moles is equals to mass over mr. That's a very basic formula. Mass we are given with, इसको divide कर देंगे mr से. For carbon it's 12. For hydrogen, it's 1. Just check this out from the periodic table. Don't be risky. Don't risk your grades. Even if you know, just recheck it from the periodic table. Okay? It's always good to be safe. Divided by 16 because 16 is the for oxygen. Now just, do simple maths and get your answers. 3.33 for carbon. Ratio 6.7 for hydrogen and divided by 16. 3.334 for oxygen as well. Okay, step number 1. Let me identify the steps because that's gonna make it easy for you to learn. Calculation of empirical formula. Just learn these steps and that's gonna be easy. Step number 1 is calculate the moles. How do you calculate the moles? You're going to be given with the mass, just divide it by mr and get the moles. That is your step number 1. That is to calculate the moles. Now let's move on to the step 2. Step 2 is divide all the values, all the moles by the smallest value. ठीक है? अब इन तीनों में this, and this. What is the smallest value? Obviously 3.3 is smaller than 6.7. So you're going to divide all 3 of these by the smallest value, that's 3.33. 6.7 is going to be divided by 3.33. Also divide this by 3.33. Over here your answer is going to be 1 ratio 6.7 divided by 3.33. You're gonna get 2 answer. You're gonna get 2.01 on calculator. You get 2.01, but what you have to do is you have to round it off to one significant figure. Okay? Two significant figures you got to round it off. अगर हम इसको 2 significant figures पे round off करें तो हमारे पास आंसर आएगा only 2. And you're gonna get 1 over here. That means the empirical formula we've generated. This was carbon, means carbon is in this empirical formula is 1. Hydrogen is 2 and oxygen is also 1. This is the empirical formula. However, we cannot calculate what was the question was asking. How many oxygen atoms are there in each molecule of the compound. We don't have the molecular formula. So we cannot calculate the molecules. Because jab tak we don't know the molecular formula, we cannot. So let's figure out how can we find the molecular formula. We're given with one more piece of information and that's 90. That is the MR, the molecular mass. Achha, yahan pe step 2 I forgot to write. Just write down step 2. Divide the moles. Divide the moles with the smallest value. देखिए इसमें हमारे पास स्मॉलेस्ट वैल्यू क्या थी 3.3 ये लें. Okay, we're done with the step 1 and 2 and we have generated the empirical formula. अब हमें relative molecular mass दिया हुआ है which is the MR and that's 90. देखें, मतलब एक मॉलिक्यूल में जब हम टोटल सारे चीज़ों को, कार्बन, हाइड्रोजन, ऑक्सीजन को ऐड करेंगे तो हमारे पास आंसर 90 आना चाहिए. दैट इज़ व्हाट इट मीन्स टू हैव एन एम आर ऑफ 90. नाउ लेट्स चेक कि हमारा कितना आ रहा है. कार्बन देखें, हमारे पास तो एक कार्बन है, हमारे एम्पिरिकल फार्मूला का कितना आ रहा है. एक कार्बन हमारे पास 12 है, हाइड्रोजन 2 है, तो 2 टाइम्स 1, ये 2 हाइड्रोजन का है और 1 उसका मास है, प्लस ऑक्सीजन जो कि है 16. Just get this done and work out the empirical formula mass. 12 plus 2 plus 16, and that's going to give you 30. Now, unfortunately, our empirical formula mass is 30. Let me write it down. That's the empirical formula mass. ठीक है, जो हमने empirical formula generate किया ये वाला. That is the empirical formula we've generated. And the mass of the empirical formula is 30, and this 90 is the molecular formula mass. Acha, now we're gonna learn equation that's gonna give us n, and that's gonna tell us what is gonna be the molecular formula. ठीक है. The equation says that, according to that equation, just learn it by heart. It says that when you take your molecular formula mass, एक सेकेंड यहाँ पे एक लाइन लगा लेते हैं. When you take your molecular formula mass and you divide it by your empirical formula mass, you are gonna get a term that's n. ठीक है, just learn this thing by heart, that whenever you're gonna have your molecular formula mass and you divide it by your empirical formula mass, you're gonna get a term that's known as n. Now I'm telling you step by step. The first step is do this thing. Divide your molecular formula mass by your empirical formula mass and you're going to get a term n. तो सबसे पहले हम अपना n निकालते हैं. Just learn these steps by heart. हमारा molecular formula mass हमने ऊपर ये निकाला था, which was निकाला नहीं था, it was given in the question, which was 90 divided by the empirical formula mass जो हमने खुद generate किया वो है 30. So 90 divided by 30 is going to give you 3. 3 is the value of n. Now we figure out the value of n. Now according to the steps I've told you, the next step is multiply. I'm writing step number 2. Multiply your n value with your empirical formula. What was your empirical formula? देखें, ये हमने empirical formula ये निकाला था ना, C1H2O1. ठीक है, C1H2 and O1. Now what does it mean to multiply your n with it? इस पूरे को मल्टीप्लाई करना है n के साथ. What does it mean is कि n तो 3 है, तो let's write 3 instead of n. H2 and O1, that's going to be multiplied by 3. What does it mean is कि जो इनके नीचे values है ना, these little values, ये 1, these little values, this 2, this 1 and this 1 under carbon, that's going to be multiplied with the n. देखें, 1 times 3 is 3. ये carbon का जो 1 है ना नीचे, this 1 underneath carbon is going to be multiplied with the value of n. n हमारा 3 है, carbon के नीचे 1 है, so हम 1 को 3 से multiply कर देंगे. 1 3 times is 3. फिर ये जो हमारा 2 है ना हाइड्रोजन का, इसको हम अपने n से मल्टीप्लाई कर देंगे. n क्या है? 3. फिर इस 1 को भी n से मल्टीप्लाई करना है. मल्टीप्लाई योर n वैल्यू विद एम्पेरिकल फार्मूला, मतलब इनके नीचे जो जो वैल्यूज़ हैं दे आर ऑल गोना बी मल्टीप्लाइड विद n. ठीक है, जब कार्बन के इस 1 को 3 से मल्टीप्लाई किया तो 3 आंसर आया. C3H इस 2 को 3 से मल्टीप्लाई किया तो आया 6. और जब इस O के 1 को 3 से मल्टीप्लाई किया तो आंसर आया 3. ठीक है, राइट नाउ यू माई थिंक इट्स टेकिंग अ लॉट ऑफ टाइम, बट वंस यू गाइज प्रैक्टिस यू गोना बी as quick as a rabbit in the exam hall. ठीक है, right now it's taking exam but practice and that's gonna make it fine. Now we have generated the molecular formula. This is the molecular formula. If you follow the steps I've told, ठीक है, which were first you divide the molecular formula mass by the empirical formula, you get a value of n. ठीक है, and after you've got the value of n, you multiply your n value with your empirical formula. This was the empirical formula we generated. This was the n. We multiplied our n with the numbers in the empirical formula, and once we multiplied 3 with this one, we got 3. Then we multiplied this 3 with 2, we got 6. Then we multiplied this 3 with 1 and we got 3, and that's how we generated molecular formula. Okay, once you guys are done with the molecular formula, now you have the molecular formula. You know it's C3H6 and O3. C3H6O3, that's your molecular formula. Let's write it down. C3H6 and O3. That is your one molecule of the compound you were given with. Okay? How many oxygen atoms are in each molecule of compound? We've just figured it out. We've figured out the molecular formula. This is the formula for one molecule. We have it here. Formula for one molecule, and the oxygen in it are 3. So the correct option is going to be option C. I hope that made sense to you guys. If it did, do consider subscribing to my channel and like this video and give it a thumbs up, and thanks for watching. See you later in the next video.